Welcome one more day to Space in Armonía. I'm going to speak about something very profound. Some of you are interested in this. I receive several questions connected to autism, and it's something that touches my soul very deep, because in my process of self-discovery, I realized that I share many traits with those who are usually labeled as autistic or having Asperger, ADHD and other labels invented by several wise agrees. And I think it's very important to find out why all this is happening, why there are certain characteristics that in many occasions are even shared by people that in principle have nothing. I mean, they have been able to adapt to a rather sick society. But this is the problem, because no matter how much doctors, scientists, educators want us to adapt to society, some of us are different, and we didn't come here to adapt. We came here to inspire a change in different forms. And obviously, when you have a soul that has more sensitivity and you enter a body in a psychopathic, sociopathic society, you are going to have problems of adaptation, neurological impairments, different conditions that are painful. And there are many of us who share those conditions, even have suffered traumas because of abuse, violence, being overwhelmed with the situation of the world. So we have to explore in depth all this. I know people who are struggling, and for me it has been a great discovery to see that behind what is usually called mental illness or inabilities and other labels, there is something which is extremely important even for the future of humanity. I hope this is helpful for you. Just tell me if this reaches your heart. This is the reason of this channel. So let's begin. First of all, I'm sure that if you are watching this video, it's because you have something special. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening to me. I'm very sure that if you are listening to me right now, it's because you are looking for something deeper, an explanation of what you are living. Many others have been realizing that there is something behind the conditions of struggle of humanity. I even know a person that pointed this to me several years ago. I spoke about her in several occasions. Beth, my friend Beth. And I'm sure she's going to enjoy this video. As I said, I found in myself some of the traits that are usually attributed to autistic people. I even did some tests in the internet. I leave the links down below so you can test yourself as well. It might surprise you. My result was, in one test, 32 over 50 questions. And in other, I even tested for a bit more than a half. This was for Asperger. And it's because some of the traits within the autistic spectrum are shared by many. It's clear that our soul is different, and we experience more struggle than most people trying to adapt to this physical experience. And this doesn't mean some of the conditions cannot be improved. Actually, there are different causes behind autism and ADHD, the so-called attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, and other traits that are due either to post-traumatic stress disorder or to gut disorders, to family secrets. This can be transmitted from generation to generation as something that cannot be spoken within the family and generates an emotional trauma that is manifested in autistic people. In some cases, there can also be brain damage, but in general, I think the autistic spectrum expresses neurodiversity. There are brains that are wired up in a different way, and we shouldn't think there is something wrong with that brain. And this is important to understand because I would say most people think that someone, just for the reason of being autistic, is mentally disabled or sick. That's not the case. Sometimes it's not sickness, it's not a mental disease as such. Humanity in general is mentally sick, emotionally retarded, or even cognitively retarded, no matter how much they mark high in their IQ. Intelligence is not just a question of intellectual cognition. There is a depth of intelligence that many people don't have because they are more psychopathic. I even heard some doctors say autistic people are not empathic, and this is not true. Some of them are very empathic. Empathy is one of the characteristics of beautiful souls, and there are many beautiful souls behind many of those who are labeled as autistic, Asperger, or whatever. And I can assure you, many of us have so much empathy and hypersensitivity that the world around us is very overwhelming sometimes. And if we close ourselves or seem shy or having some mental dysfunction because we are unable to speak well or adapt to society, it's not because we have a disease, but precisely because it's very difficult for us to adapt to this society. And we didn't come here to adapt, as I said. So you might be within this range of the so-called autistic characteristics. So you can have an idea. I will give certain characteristics, and later on I will say some of the possible causes. One of the characteristics of autism is awkwardness in the way of communicating with others. There is something different in the way autistic people communicate or is unable to communicate because there are different kinds of autism, not just different causes. And they might be unable to say words properly. This is the classic type of autism in which a child encloses himself and is unable to communicate with his parents. And this is usually a source of suffering for the parents. But in other occasions, autistic people are highly communicative. They are even socializing with others in a rather normal way because they have adapted. This is more usually the case of those diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. I don't like to use the word syndrome or even Asperger because that's just a surname. Nowadays it seems that someone is Asperger and it has something wrong. I think there is something different and we have to think in a different way. But those labeled as Asperger can have even a very high IQ, above 70. And some doctors call them highly functioning autistic, something which is preposterous. because no matter how much you are struggling to adapt, if there is a struggle, there is going to be a dysfunction of some sort. This is the reason why some people that have been able to adapt, being Asperger or whatever, have got dysfunctions or certain clumsiness in the way they move. So to say they are highly functioning because they are just performing some of the social tasks, it doesn't mean there is not something that must be addressed in a different way. Actually, I will leave the link to a channel known as Asperger from the Inside. A man from Australia is the protagonist, and it's a very good channel. And he explains Asperger because he lives Asperger. He has been diagnosed with Asperger. And he says there is no such thing as highly functioning autism, because there are struggles, there are even reactions that a person usually has, even decades after being adapting, having maybe a career or a family. And this is very typical because many people are not usually diagnosed with autism until they are 30, 40, because they have been masking their traits. But that's not highly functioning. They have certain problems of adaptation, of management of energy sometimes. They might be experiencing shutdowns, meltdowns, all these experiences in which the person might feel absolutely depressed, aggressive. They can even explode with bad language because the level of stress inside is so intense that they explode. And this has to be managed. So the problems of communication are always going to be there. Some of us had problems of communication from childhood. I have overcome most of these problems, becoming an expert in communication, but it was very difficult for me. And this is something most people cannot understand. They think some of us are rather normal or like them, but it's not the case. And I will explain why this is. Some of us came with a different type of soul, but there is this aspect of communication which is different. Sometimes the communication of autistic people, especially those with Asperger, can be excessively logical, very descriptive. For instance, there is a trait which is the use of technical language. Some Asperger people are extraordinary speaking, even before audiences. And many would say they are genius, and that's, I would say, the word. Actually, I know the case of a French girl that was diagnosed with autism. She was called Anaël, and years ago she wrote a book releasing an important message for humanity. She spoke of the Messianic era, telling about the important changes that are going to take place in relation with the divine and humanity. And this is not so strange within the Hebrew wisdom tradition, because according to many Kabbalists, autistic people, or some of them at least, are garments used by the souls of prophets that come here to release important messages for humanity. Now, this doesn't mean all autistic people are like that, but within the autistic range, there are many who are able to express themselves very well. And it's because they can develop a very technical way of thinking. Actually, many of the Asperger people came to be famous in the world of science or arts Einstein was probably Asperger, Nikola Tesla. Nowadays, Elon Musk has confessed that he has been diagnosed with Asperger. Bill Gates, famous artists such as James Taylor. This is a very interesting case because he is not only a wonderful country song singer, but he overcame drug addiction. This is very important because some people struggling with the so-called autistic spectrum have difficulties in adaptation, and this leads to certain problems with drugs, sexual disorders, and alcohol. And this is why it's so important to address this issue, because some people think they are bad, that they are not loved by others, because they feel different. This is one of the characteristics of autism. You feel different, and you struggle to adapt sometimes. But this is a problem, because you cannot adapt to a society which is already sick. You can adapt to some extent, but this is going to generate tension, and therefore addictions, disorders of many kinds. So the communication, the adaptation problems are there. There are also tics, stimming, which is self-stimulatory movements, repetitions. Many of us have those sort of tics. When I was a child, I used to move hands and feet very fast because I felt an incredible energy, vitality, hyperactivity, doctors would say. And I had to do it, moving my hands like this, and sometimes I still do it. When I'm very enthusiastic about something or listening to music, I feel the need to agitate myself, and it's very pleasant. There is something behind all this. The soul tries to express itself, and it needs to expand. So I had to learn how to calm down and express my soul in a different way. So I don't do it as much as I used to do it, but those who are usually regarded as autistic do these things more often. They find themselves rocking like this. This is very typical. And they move maybe their shoulders like this, or they have a strange way of moving their body. This is because the soul is trying to adapt to the body, and it's so much charged with energy that it's not easy. But I don't think there is something wrong with those movements. It's very important to stimming when you have that condition. Other characteristic of the spectrum is routines, love of rules, obsession with justice. So if you say to an autistic person, you are doing this wrong or you are not fair, this person is going to be in trouble. They might get angry, react with anger, and there is also a characteristic which is the difficulty in adapting to the other point of view and accept the criticism of others. And this is something many of us share. I don't like being criticized, especially when I know that I'm right about something. And I hate when others try to change me. This might put me in a very negative state. And I know how to throw darts very easily because I know the weak points of people. And sometimes a harsh character might come out. Others might think this is bad, negative, but some of us feel with the right of being a little bit harsh when someone is trying to abuse us or force us into their ways. And I think Issue had some behaviors that express Geburah, the force, the left side. when he expelled the merchants from the temple, for instance, that's not precisely smooth. That's harsh. Now, I'm not justifying any form of harshness or violence, but in some occasions, it's necessary to be a little bit bitter, especially with those who think they know everything and they have the right to step over you or whatever. Zero tolerance with some of the so-called experts that try to impose their views. Now, it's also necessary to be very careful with this because in some cases, people that have been diagnosed with autism feel themselves with the right of insulting or breaking up things or behaving in a very distressful way just because they have been diagnosed like that, and they think it's normal in their case. There are some YouTube videos. I watched the other day one in Spanish. Now, there is another characteristic, which is hypersensitivity. In many occasions, those considered as autistic feel more intensely everything around. This is why in many cases they are highly empathic, but it's overwhelming for them to feel what others feel. And then they shut down. They go within themselves to protect themselves from the world, from what they feel. And several noises or sounds can be scaring for them. The sound of a motorbike, the wind, even a bird can scare in some cases. And I admit that some noises are very disturbing for me. When I hear a plane over me, I have to stop recording. It's very annoying. When I hear a motorbike, I find it very difficult to stand. I don't like city noises in general. This is why we came to live in this environment. In some cases, even the voices of others can be disturbing because we sense there is something in their soul which is not harmonious. And hypersensitivity is not something you usually find in most people which are lacking sensitivity. There is a lot of psychopathy and sociopathy. I already said that one of the best psychiatrists, Kazimierz Dabrowski from Poland, used to say that most medical and educational institutions are run by psychopaths. And he was a psychiatrist. So he probably was right. This is why many children suffer in their schools. And we all have suffered conventional education, having troubles in adaptation because of this oversensitivity, which in many cases generates stress. And this stress is behind skin problems, for instance, gut problems. This is very common. I have suffered both severe conditions of gut dysfunction and allergies. It was very difficult for me to overcome all this, and sometimes I even have certain sensitivities to certain foods. But I tend to feel better when I understand the origin of all this. For me, it was amazing to realize that I had something different and I don't have to struggle to be like the others, that I just have to be me and realize that I came to bring something beautiful to the world and help others find themselves. This released an amazing amount of tension and I started to feel much better. Some allergies started to go away, and this was part of my healing process. Self-recognition, self-acceptance, loving, caring for oneself and others is very important in healing. And we have to help as well those who are labeled as autistic, Asperger, ADHD, because they are struggling. One of the reasons why I started to teach these things in a course, harmonitherapy, is because I want to give a different perspective. And some people have been working with me for long. I have even a student, a psychologist, a wonderful woman who tries to make a contact between psychology and spirituality. And the other day she said that she feels very thankful, and she made me realize that this job some of us are doing is very important, because we are bringing different views to the world that can be very healing. Now, another characteristic of the spectrum is over-logical thinking, hyper-logical processes of speaking, sometimes long emails. This is a characteristic that I have. Sometimes people ask me things and I don't have any inconvenience to speak, to share everything. Oversharing is another characteristic, and I found myself very much in tune with all those traits, because I've always had the tendency to speak a lot about something that I love, especially when someone asks me. And I can write long emails with long descriptions. And people with no sensitivity at all can find that very boring, and they don't reply an email. They feel overwhelmed because they are different, and they don't realize we are different. They might think we are very intellectual, but it's not that you are very intellectual. You can be very deep in your feelings. You can express yourself with intellectual concepts. Asperger people, the Aspies, are usually very technical in the way they speak. Sometimes they can be regarded as pedantic, but I don't think is the term that should be used in this way. Pedantic is when someone is trying to presume they know more. This is something never ever done by people within the autistic spectrum. They don't try to demonstrate anything. They are just like that because they perceive the world in a different way. And sometimes people from my family got angry with me because of the way I express myself, and they say they don't understand me. And for me, it's not easy to be among people that are so superficial. This is another trait. Sometimes those within the autistic range spectrum get angry with others because they felt misunderstood. They are struggling to making themselves understandable, and they sense the others don't understand, so they might have the tendency to think the others are stupid, mentally retarded. And in a sense it's true in general. I don't deny that. But I'm not insulting. My intention is not to hurt, it's to pinpoint something. So I think it's not proper to call autistic people mentally disabled, because everyone is mentally disabled. So what's the point of trying to define a condition when someone is sharing that trait? There can be people with very high IQ, but to be very intellectual doesn't mean you are more intelligent. They might not have emotional intelligence. When I was a kid, my parents were told that I was unable to learn properly, that I wouldn't be able to access higher education. And I always had problems of adaptation. I was unable to learn all the lies in the school. I had my mind wired up in a different way. Obviously my brain was wired up in a different way. I suffer bullying, different kinds of violence and abuse, and it was very difficult for me to cope with all that. Over the years I overcame certain traumas because I became an expert in the structure of trauma, and in the process of healing, developing my own way of accessing therapy, combining the wisdom of music, armonía, depth, psychology. And this is why I developed the course Harmonic Therapy, teaching all these things. And I think when I experienced all that as a child and in later stages in my life was for a reason. So I don't think that all the so-called mental impairments, diseases, conditions such as autism are, strictly speaking, something bad, something to be avoided. I think they are part of the process of healing. Because in order to heal, you have to experience the trouble first. So darkness is part of the way the light discovers itself, herself, himself, whatever we want to say. Because the light is whole, is masculine and feminine, and even beyond that. So I think we have to accept disabilities, disease, as part of a healing process. This is heavy stuff because it releases a huge tension. And when I was a child, it was very difficult because even my parents thought I could have something, but I'm very thankful because they never forced me to do something I didn't like. I remember that sometimes in the school we were tested psychologically. We spent hours answering stupid questions, and there was something strange or different in the way I answered because I was always summoned by the psychologist in charge, and they asked me additional questions. Sometimes I even thought, what happens that I am very intelligent, but it was probably the other way around within their parameters. I was probably not scoring high in the IQ or too normal. I don't know what they found, but the thing is that they said that I wouldn't be able to study properly, and I not only finished school and even went to university later on, but in the last course the psychologist called me after one of these tests and he said, well, wouldn't you like to teach music? I think he was thinking that that would be the only thing I would be able to do. He knew I was good in music because I had been playing in the talent festival. And I said, well, if I can teach something which is mine, something that adapts to the way I see things, I would love to show what I have to show, but not to people that are not interested. And he looked at me in a very strange way, as if saying, we can't do anything else with you. And he just left me out. So it hasn't been easy for many of us to express our truth because we felt ourselves misunderstood. And this led to many tensions. So we have to be very patient with others. I'm very thankful that my parents didn't force me to behave like others. They gave me freedom to be myself, so to say. And right now I feel sadness, not only because I witnessed the death of my mom. She felt the struggles with my dad, and it hasn't been easy for them to understand me and my sister. And it's now difficult for me to see my dad experience cognition problems, losing his abilities, experiencing the first traits of dementia. I think the problem is that in many occasions people don't find their way to the soul and they lose motivation. And it's been very frustrating for me to be unable to communicate this richness better. But I hope we are just the first stepping stones so that in the future others can do a better job in this way. I think the suffering and death of many should be part of the healing process. This is the way I can see it, in a rather constructive way, to release tension, because the suffering is still there. The sorrow and the sadness is part of human life. So some of us are different, and I don't think it's easy for most people to understand us. I think some of us came here for a change, and we should understand that when the soul is being born, the energy raises up, and we have to harmonize mind, heart, and body so that there is not an impairment of neurological processes. I think the soul has to learn how to live in a physical body. This is something I learned mostly from the psychology of the fourth way, popularized by Mr. Gurdjieff and his pupils. And I think many of the neurological impairments can be explained that way. When the soul has more intensity, because it has been born in a body, there is a greater amount of energy, sensitivity. And if you are not aligning mind, heart, and body properly, there are short circuits, there can be an excess of energy running up and down without order. And this is the origin of some of the mental problems, difficulties in cognition, tics, the necessity of moving oneself too much sometimes, stress, nervous activity. And this can be compared to phase conjugation in electricity. There was even a genius, an Asperger, which was Nikola Tesla, and he invented the three-phase wiring. Someday I will explain this in more detail, but you have to think in terms of distribution of energy. In Kabbalah they call that Keter, the distributing capacity, the crown. And when you have the crown of life, you are able to distribute all your energy gifts. You align soul and body by harmonizing mind, heart, and body. And this is very important to address the issue. In other cases, autism can be due to family secrets. If there have been abuses, rapes, violence, sometimes this generates such an amount of emotional trauma that it causes neurological problems because of the tension, and a kid can be born with the inability to speak properly and so on. So until the family addresses the issue consciously, stopping the pattern of abuse, autism is not going to cease. There can also be gut problems. In fact, I will leave a link of a wonderful testimony from a woman from Colombia, I think. She had a baby, and When he grew up, the kid was diagnosed with autism because he stopped communicating, but it was not something that he had from the beginning. He became autistic. So we have to distinguish between congenital autisms and acquired conditions of autism. And most doctors told her that there was no solution for that. She felt very upset because she thought she had lost her kid, until she found a doctor who said, we have a solution for that. In the case of your son, this is due to a dysbiosis, an imbalance in the gut. There are bad bacteria, an excess of fungi, because the vaccines that this kid received, especially there is a vaccine many of us receive, which is in Spain we call it triple viric. I don't know in other countries, but supposedly it protects you against chickenpox, polio, and rubeola. And this fills the gut with viruses. It doesn't matter they are deactivated, they are still there, and the immune system gets crazy because you are putting shit which should not be there, and this generates an imbalance in the gut. So the gut generates an excess of mucus to protect itself, but this excess of mucus keeps certain nutrients from coming into the stream, and there is also a lack of production of serotonin, the well-being hormone, dopamine, the motivation hormone. And this is the reason why some autistic people have problems in feeling well, or the reason why some have ADHD. That's not the cause, that's part of the symptom. This is what many doctors don't understand, because they try to explain things with the symptoms. They don't go to the root. This is why Socrates, more than 2,000 years ago, said that this is like arguing that we are here standing because our bones and our muscles are sustaining us. That's not adding any information. And most of the so-called scientific diagnoses are pseudoscientific. They are just superficial. Now, going back to the kid with this gut condition, he recovered himself because he followed for a period of time a very restrictive diet, which is known as a specific carbohydrate diet recommended by this doctor. In this diet, you can eat starchless vegetables such as zucchini, cooked carrot, cabbage, things like this, and also certain fish, meat, but you suppress dairy products, most starchy products, cereals, legumes, potatoes in the beginning, and everything that has lots of starch, because that's complex sugar that cannot be properly digested, and bad bacteria love it, fungi love it, so they live of that. And by restricting these products, there is a regulation in the gut. This doesn't mean you cannot eat that later on. Of course you can when you are recovered. And in any case, eating low amounts of starch is very recommended. And the proof it works is that this kid no longer has autistic traits, and he eats everything. He even can have some junk food, but be careful with that. Of course, all that was out of the first diet. For 4 months, he had to follow a very restrictive diet. Now, that's one way of regulating, but obviously it's not the only one. We have to address the issue in a greater way. Music therapy, for instance, the Tomatis Method has proven to be very effective to help many kids with autism to start communicating. Very interesting. Because it means the energy can be addressed and channeled in a more harmonious way. This means that in many cases, autism traits are due to an energy which is not balanced. This is why sometimes they try to self-regulate, looking for routines, something that is in order. This makes them feel very well. But in other cases, those who have ADHD, they might have the opposite, be very disorganized, clumsy, or they can feel hyperactivity, inability to attend to those things they don't like. I find a certain struggle against the terminology ADHD because they say attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. But I would ask the experts, aren't people in general lacking attention? Is attention the real problem? Because most people that are within the autistic range and those labeled as ADHD kids have an extraordinary capacity to pay attention to those things they love. Maybe they like to paint, to play music. That's not an attention disorder. That's a motivation disorder, because you don't know how to educate, how to show the kid the way to his passion. So it's not an attention problem, it's a problem of how to manage the talent, the energy. The energy is not just something physical or material. It's something that comes from the source of beauty, of love. So how you express that beauty and love is the key. Actually, many artists have been diagnosed with Asperger, and they try to channel their creativity in music, movies. Unfortunately, many of them end up in addictions. Right now, we are seeing, for instance, the case of Johnny Depp in his trial with his ex. And I think he has some traits that fall within the autistic spectrum, because you can recognize that. It doesn't mean he has been diagnosed as autistic, but he played the role of Edward Scissorhands perfectly. And you can see Asperger traits in that character. Actually, Tim Burton, the director of that movie, has been diagnosed with Asperger. And you can see all that expressed in his movies. Tim Burton movies are very peculiar. Sleepy Hollow, Nightmare Before Christmas, and all that. In them you can see a certain creative way of expressing the so-called autistic spectrum traits. And this is the way he copes with those traits. He probably has been struggling as everyone else. And I'm sure many artists that have been famous or popular have traits from the autistic spectrum. You can see some of them are considered as shy. It's not shyness, it's the way they feel. They feel overwhelmed by everything around, and they enclose themselves. And they are beautiful souls. They are not sick. We have to take from our mind this way of labeling things, and they are just different. And many more things can be said about this. I could be speaking hours and hours, but I don't want to make the video longer. Tell me what you think, support the channel. Those of us who are working to express these truths are struggling. For us, it's twice as difficult to cope with certain things. So any support is very welcome. We cannot adapt like other people, so we have to find alternative ways of surviving. And those of you who contribute are part of the healing process. So share the channel, give thumbs up, speak to others about all these things, support in any way. Thank you very much for listening with attention. I will come back to this issue because I think I'm discovering more and more important keys to what we are living, digging up in these so-called autistic spectrum conditions and things of the sort. There are even other extremes which are interesting, such as borderline personality disorder and narcissism. I think those are other extremes, very different from autistic traits, and they are also due to the inability to express the greater beauty and love of the soul. So human beings are not bad in themselves, but mismanagement of energy can lead to problems of different kinds and even violence, dysfunctions. So let's be more responsible. Let's keep cleaning and harmonizing mind, heart, and body to express the infinite love and modified life, integral conscience, and deep, blissful serenity.